Hi, good morning or good afternoon, whenever you watch this lecture. This is one of the beauties of online teaching. You can even watch it at 2 a.m. in the morning if you feel like it. So today, we kind of start the second week of this class, so you already have a third over, which is one of the crazy aspects of this fast winter session. Probably also a little scary for you guys. And again, if you have any questions along the way, never hesitate to email me. I really try to be quick. On the weekends a little less, but during the week I really try to answer right away. So today I'm actually going to talk about the political economy of the Middle East. And those of you who have taken the prereq for this class, some of you slipped through, so you might not have. Political economy is kind of an old shoe, right? So you kind of know what that is. But I want to recap that a little bit, just to have us all on the same page. We talked already a little bit about the political economy of the Middle East when I talked about the history, because the economic history of the Middle East is, as I will make the point today, as important as the political one. So let's look into what political economy actually is and what do I mean when I talk about it. What is political economy in the Middle East, specifically after World War II? I mean, you can have political economy analysis on every country, every region in the world, but what is specific about the Middle East? And then I will introduce you to resource endowment groups. And the graduate students of you already know that because you already covered that in the readings, but I want to have that everybody kind of is aware of these groups exist the same way as regime types exist. So let us dive into right away. So what is political economy? I think it's a very exciting way of analyzing politics that we should all be aware of. So it's basically studying the effects of political variables, such as elections, for example, or policy reform, or just policy decision-making on economic outcomes on the one hand, but on the other hand, you can also analyze the effect of economic change, for example, the financial crisis that was going on politics. So it can go vice versa, and usually analysts do both. They look at the politics and then look how they influence economy and vice versa. So really the idea is that those two entities, politics and economy, are really tightly intertwined and you cannot really keep them separate. And you can do that in kind of three main domains of political interactions. You can do that on state policies and state itself, state structures, but you can also go a little bit, you can also look at then at the development of economy, economic agents over time, how did the economy develop, for example, throughout the financial crisis, and then look at how the social actors behaved. So we've seen that done very recently on Europe, but also, of course, in the US, or any major country in the world has a political economy analysis. So for the Middle East, it's very specifically interesting because we have this connection between authoritarian rule and economic development. So we have, on the one hand, authoritarian regimes that are very stable over time, even throughout the Arab Spring. And we'll talk about this again. Democracy was really difficult to keep hold in the region. And then we have also really poor economic development. And so one of the ways to explain this poor economic development is to connect it to the politics, to the authoritarian regime characteristic. And on the other hand, we also have, for example, this kind of paradox between democracy in research-rich countries. It's almost impossible to keep hold. So even if you have a fairly stable government and you have a very stable political development, maybe less crisis, less wars, it's still, in the case of Saudi Arabia, one of the most undemocratic countries in the world. So why is this important? I really think that political economy kind of shows nicely that neither politics nor economy can stand on itself. So economic analysis is great, helps us a lot, but doesn't explain everything. And on the other hand, it's also the politics. Only looking at the politics, of course, doesn't tell you the whole story. So it's important to keep the connection and to analyze that connection. So economic interests are, of course, a substantial part of politics, and politics is an essential part of an economy. So when we look at the political economy after World War II, and I already talked about these briefly, so I'm going to go into that a little bit more in detail, we can really have three major phases here in the Middle East. The first is the 1960s and 70s, post-independence era. The second one is kind of the last decades from 1980s to 1990s, and then everything coming out from there, 2000s until today, pretty much is the third period that you can subdivide them in. So generally, after World War II, I think the Middle East was off to a really good start. They had for the first time independence from the European powers, and you know that about your country. Every history there is very different, when and how and to which extent. But generally, we have this period of post-independence that was quite unique. I mean, there was really no interest under colonial rule to develop economies or build political institutions in any of these countries that stand by themselves, but rather produce, what was in the best interest of Britain, France, or Italy at the time. So we should not forget, some countries were even, like Algeria, were even treated as part of France, and obviously then the focus was not on building independent institutions, but building institutions that work well to the interest to the colonial rulers. For example, in the case of Libya, the main interest was here to produce oil and transport it over to Italy, to kind of suppress rather the political institutions than to kind of really only focus on that one goal. And that's very similar to other countries as well. So the Middle East and North African rulers really had this challenge to not only build new states in post-independence, but also economies. And we have that from all post-colonial countries, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa as well. But I think you could make the case, because of the proximity of these countries to their colonial rulers, this connection between the former powers holding the power in their countries, that connection was a little stronger, and the relationship overall a little bit tighter than what we have seen in sub-Saharan Africa after colonial rule. So to build a new state and economy, you don't only have to build your new bureaucracy out of scratch, basically, but also economies and identities. And I think, and even if you look just at the economic era here, colonial powers did really not retreat out of the economies. For example, Egypt was still dominated by British business interests, Morocco by French business interests, Libya by Italian business interests. So we did have, for a very long time, until today pretty much, in some cases, still a very present force of European powers active in the economic realm, although they have retreated from the political institutional aspect of it. So, but as we know, those two aspects, politics and economics, are very closely intertwined. So of course they still play a role. So for example, the oil-producing countries were still pretty heavily supported by European and Americans in the interest of using their oil. It's really only Turkey and Israel here that were the best off by developing their countries, independent from foreign interests. I mean, you remember Turkey maintained its independence, since the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922, and Israel was supported by foreign powers quite significantly, its creation and its development and keeping it sustainable in the region. But the economy was not much controlled, rather supported. So it was really up to the Israel state to build the political institutions. And I think both countries, Turkey and Israel, really significantly profited from this. So in the 1960s and 1970s, how did the governments in the Middle East then do it? So it's basically, we can summarize it as was a state-led political and economic development. So instead of keeping it, to different fractions in the society, those rulers, understandably so, focused on building up strong political institutions and then expanding, the government agencies and nationalizing businesses. So to have them then not being taken over by European powers, but really nationalizing them. And building up a government infrastructure that could actually run a state. That was all, so kind of the idea was you needed expanded state capacities, to guide and encourage economic growth, but also use jobs as reward for allies, So it's kind of a tool for building a politically like-minded elite, and then patronage system. So it was not only about building up an economy, but it was also simply to build up a functioning state at the same time in countries where tribal rivalries were pretty prominent, and that has not seen political institutions pretty much set up since the Ottoman Empire. So there were like these challenges at the same time. So the response was then to have strong import substitution, state-led industrialization. The oil boom of the 70s helped every country in the region, not only the oil-producing ones. Generally, we've seen high growth rates, improved quality of life. I think so. The general idea was that also the system that they put up kind of worked out, in the short run. that there was a lot of investment in education and public services. So overall, the MENA countries were off to a really good start in the 60s and 70s. But then, and you know that already, but in the 1980s and 90s, that's really when the Middle East regimes had to, well, the country's population had to pay the price for the type of economic and political policies that put into place in post-independence era. So we also call these the lost decades. Why? Because we've seen a really stagnant economic growth. Instead, we actually seen recession that had to do with the oil crisis, of course, but also just in the fact that investment in education just takes a while to pay off. The state-run industries were not competitive in the international market. The international competition was actually fierce, more fierce than it was after World War II. So the low economic development then was also paired with high population growth, insufficient job creation, and that then subsequently resulted in higher unemployment. And really, again, just with the exception of Israel and Turkey, the economies in the Middle East did not produce high-skilled jobs that the university graduates wanted, and their economy needed to grow. So I think that the modernization in this era was really kind of did not take place. That the promises did not take place, and they this little economic development was then responded to with reduction in public spending, but also just with the fact that political reforms were just extremely difficult because you already had this patronage system coming up. So, for example, cutting or slashing your public employees, the number of employees is just extremely difficult for the regimes because that's a patronage system. They're afraid that if they don't have that patronage system of patronage and elites around them, they will not be able to keep their regimes going. So one of the reactions that major reactions towards the idea of really moving towards a market economy and reduce public spending was then the Washington Consensus. So the idea of leading of liberalizing your trade, privatizing public enterprise, and opening up the financial sector, and devaluing the national currency sharply to encourage exports. That was the idea. And also the connection then to lending, big lending institutions like IMF and International Monetary Fund programs. So, for example, in the case of Morocco, that was very prominent. To really go into that direction and make the market more competitive, but it didn't work out the same way. Again, economic reforms did not match political ones, and each of your countries has a different story why that didn't work out, but all of you have a political patronage system that was really hard to change, or not in the interest of the regimes to change. So that resulted in very slow growth and even recession, and the political costs for reform were even higher then. So what happened until today? Where are we standing now? So we have seen a little recent growth. There has been an increased international pressure and bilateral pressure to liberalize economies, and there were free trade agreements made among all of these countries, most of them with the European Union, but also with the United States. But it really just deepened general economic decay and inequality. It could not respond efficiently to the challenges of each of your economies. And then regime stability then also continued to be a problem. So that is a very good example why actually we need to look at both, the political economy, so really the politics and the economy of every situation, because it really can explain quite a lot. So, for example, if you look at just other factors that played into it, and we look at international relations later on. And this week again, that, for example, just the U.S. financial assistance in the war of terror kind of worked as an external subsidy payment to budgets in Jordan, Egypt, and Morocco. And the MENA really has become the most aid-dependent region in the world, maybe only second to sub-Saharan Africa because of that. So there were also obviously other things going on than in the politics side of things. We've seen not only persistent high unemployment, low economic development, and then perceived increase of inequality, but to develop a modern economy, we really also need a stable political environment, and I think we can all agree that the MENA is not very known for having that. So war and conflict, do not help, of course. And the MENA is not only the most undemocratic region in the world, but also the most crisis-struck. But more about that really at a later point. So the politics side is really much larger sometimes to explain the economic development in and of itself, because all these rules you can apply to how the economy needs to be reformed is all well laid out, right? Liberalization of economies, freer trade, safeguards for your population, but it's all very difficult if you're having such a high political cost on the other side, and also the interest, of course, of international actors to keep your regime safe, to help you pursue the war on terror in that case, and monies just come in as a budget line. And I think this article I posted on Egypt really makes that really clear how that works in practice. So let's look a second at resource endowment groups. What do I mean with that? It's not my idea. But I think it's important to keep in mind that not every country you're working on has just a regime type, like it's a monarchy or it's a republic, have an authoritarian or more democratic style of governing. It also has certain restrictions when it comes to its economy. So, and these can be subdivided into resource endowment groups. And yeah, I have 4. So on the one, first we have the resource poor, labor abundant countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Morocco, Lebanon, for example. So they have very few natural resources, but have a lot of young labor available that all kind of play into economic development. And I will talk about this in a second a little more. Then we have the resource-rich, labor-abundant countries like Algeria, Syria, Iran. A lot of young labor force, like oil, most of the time available quite significantly. And then prominently the resource-rich, labor-poor regimes in Libya, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. And then the OECD countries, Turkey and Israel, which you already noticed probably are a little bit set aside in their development from the other countries in the region. So how does it look on a map? You notice I used that map before. So you can see that most authoritarian republics, if you take both kind of maps that I've shown you in the past about political regimes and then kind of look at that, or compare this map to the one we have here, that you can see that most authoritarian republics are either RPLA or RRLA. So in resource-rich and labor-abundant authoritarian presidents often profit from a higher per capita resource and wealth to maintain and consolidate their rule. So, for example, Saudi Arabia is or Algeria is kind of a really good example for that. So all producing countries are usually authoritarian. But oil does not necessarily need to be a recipe to stay in power. So other countries on Earth, for example, have oil and don't have authoritarian government. And for example, all MENA countries with oil were also authoritarian before they discovered the oil there. So that's not really enough to explain that. So maybe other factors play a role, so into the survival of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. And we will look at 2 important ones in the next 2 lectures, and that's first domestic politics, and then the influence of international politics hereafter. So let's summarize. The political economy is fascinating and a very important piece of political analysis or economic analysis in that matter, and should not be forgotten. Middle East is one example of many. You can take the financial crisis as the most prominent, most recent one right now. But when it comes to the politics in the about political economy in the Middle East, it's really interesting to look at these 3 phases that we talked about. So the post-independence time, then the 80s and 90s were really kind of characterized by the last decade, low economic growth. And then today we really have some signs of recovery, but generally a very, very slim outlook in how these political regimes would reform themselves. So it's important to look at, to include, in your analysis, really their source endowment group. So what is your country part of? Which group is it part of? And that's basically what you should be doing in the online discussion this week as well. So I will talk again about why politics matter in my next lecture, but this is it for me for now, and I will hear you soon again and have fun discussing the political economy of your country this week.